Good evening, brothers and sisters from Western Indonesia, Central Indonesia, and Eastern Indonesia. Good evening one more time and welcome to the Sola Scriptura academic lecture, the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament era, by Professor Gary M. Burge, Ph.D., October 15th and 22nd, 2021. We welcome brothers and sisters to enjoy our session today from Sola Scriptura. I would like to ask my brother Johnny to share the slides for the guidance and the agenda for our lecture with Professor Burge tonight. And good morning to you, Professor. Yeah, you are in the, I think, 8:00 a.m., right?
Yes.
So you are
Yes.
very, and you
We're 12 hours different. Yep,
yeah.
It is.
Amazing.
So good morning to each of you, or good evening, depending.
Yeah. Okay, Johnny, could you share the screen? Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, Sola Scriptura, annual lectures on biblical studies, is annual event in the form of seminar lecture, which is interdenominational and open for all Christian communities, Christian intellectuals, could be lecturers or seminary students or other intellectuals, as well as pastors, evangelists, and church leaders and activists. Sola Scriptura exists to support Christians in Indonesia to reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ, so that Christians in Indonesia may no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful seeming, taken from Ephesians 4:13-14. Sola Scriptura introduces Christians in Indonesia to the latest studies of the Bible from world-class biblical scholars in order to be able to critically review the credibility of various significant information about the Bible and its truth in social media. Next slide, please. Yes, thank God. We have, up until last night, we have 300 people registered from 31 theological seminaries from all over Indonesia. We thank God for this. And with denomination from Reformed, Evangelical, Lutheran, Baptist, Pentecostal, and Catholic. And we see the pie chart here. It's amazing, you know, and we have texted Dr. Burge last night that he's amazed with these statistics. Okay, next. Okay, this is our agenda today. All right, so we will have the opening reading and we're gonna have the lecture. The lecture will be in 2 sessions for tonight. And we talk about the Greco-Roman world of Jesus and Paul today. All right, next week we're gonna talk the Jewish world of Jesus and Paul. All right, so we're gonna have the lecture for 40 minutes from Professor, and we have a Q&A session. All right, and a break. We're gonna have a break because this is a lecture. You can take a coffee on that. All right, and then we continue with the lecture and then Q&A, and we finish. Okay, without further ado, I would like to ask, kindly request our Sola Scriptura chairman to give the opening reading and remarks. Pak Yosafat Wiguna, please.
Okay, thank you, Carlo. Good evening, dear brothers and sisters in Christ. On behalf of Sola Scriptura and Perkantas, I would like to welcome you to Sola Scriptura academic lectures with the topic of the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament era, which will be given by Professor Gary Burge from Calvin Theological Seminary, United States of America. Praise be to our God, our Almighty God, for His love and mercy to all of us, that we can gather in this evening to study His Word together. On this opportunity, I would like to thank Dr. Gary Burge for your willingness and passion to teach us today and next week. It's an honor for us to have you with us, as well as a blessing from God for your teaching. Dr. Burge, please allow me to say greetings to all participants in Indonesia. Ibu Bapak, saudara-saudari yang saya kasihi dan saya hormati, terima kasih atas antusiasme dan partisipasi di dalam kuliah akademis Sola Scriptura malam ini dan juga Jumat depan. Izinkan saya dalam kesempatan ini memperlihatkan daftar peserta yang hadir atau mendaftar di dalam kuliah akademis kita selama 2 Jumat ini dan Jumat depan. Seperti yang Ibu Bapak lihat di list ini, ada 37 institusi yang mendaftar untuk mengikuti kuliah akademis kita di malam ini dan juga Jumat depan. Ini daftar ini disusun berdasarkan urutan abjad ya Ibu Bapak ya. Kita lihat dari mulai nomor 1, Divisi Pengajaran GBI Gatot Subroto, ada IAKN dari Ambon, IAKN Manado, IAKN Tarutung, IAKN Toraja, Keuskupan Agung Jakarta, Sekolah Tinggi Filsafat Driakara, Jakarta, Sekolah Tinggi Filsafat dan Teologi Jakarta, STT Abdi Sabda Medan, STT Abdiel Ungaran, STT Aletia Malang, STT Amanat Agung Jakarta, STT Bandung, STT Baptis Bandung, STT Baptis Indonesia Semarang, STT Battle Indonesia Jakarta, STT Battle The Way Jakarta, STT BNKP Sunderman Nias, STT Bukit Zaitun Sambas dari Kalimantan Barat, STT Cipanas, STT HKBP Pematang Siantar, STT IKAT Jakarta, STT Iman Jakarta, STT Intim Makassar, STT Jeffrey Makassar, STT Makedonia Ngabang Kalimantan Barat, STT Moria Tangerang, STT Reform Indonesia Jakarta, STT Reform Injili Internasional Jakarta, STT Saat Malang, STT Salem Malang, STT Simpson Ungaran, STT Trinity Parapat, STTII Yogyakarta, Fakultas Teologi UKDW Yogyakarta, UKIT Tomohon, dan yang terakhir Fakultas Teologi UKSW Salatiga. Demikian list peserta yang menghadiri kuliah akademis kita selama 2 kali kesempatan ini, Ibu Bapak. Kami dari Sola Scriptura berterima kasih atas dukungan Ibu Bapak pimpinan institusi STT-STT yang mendorong mahasiswanya untuk berpartisipasi. Dan beberapa Ibu Bapak pimpinan dan juga para dosen juga hadir saat ini. Ini sungguh suatu kehormatan bagi kami. Kami juga mengapresiasi beberapa peserta yang datang dari latar belakang non-teologi, yang kami sebut Bible enthusiast, yang punya passion untuk belajar, khususnya studi biblika, walaupun mereka tidak punya latar belakang studi teologi. Selamat datang juga untuk Bapak Ibu Saudara-saudari sekalian. Harapan kami sesuai dengan visi dan misi dari pelayanan Sola Scriptura, pelayanan kita, kuliah kita selama 2 kali kesempatan ini bisa menjadi bekal yang baik dan bermanfaat bagi Ibu Bapak Saudara-saudari sekalian melalui pembelajaran studi biblika yang berbobot, berimbang, dan bertanggung jawab. Sekali lagi, terima kasih atas partisipasi dan dukungan Ibu Bapak sekalian. Tuhan Yesus memberkati kita semua. Amin.
Thank you, Pak Yosafat Wiguna, for your opening remarks. Now we will be united in prayer to open this lecture, and I kindly request Pendeta Yohanes Budi, Ph.D, to lead us in a prayer.
Mari kita berdoa. Pada malam hari ini, kami datang di hadapan-Mu dan kami mengucap syukur untuk segala kebaikan-Mu ya Bapa, karena Dikau telah memungkinkan kami yang berada di berbagai lokasi dan wilayah, dan juga yang berasal dari berbagai institusi dan denominasi. Kami bersyukur karena diberikan satu kesempatan untuk bersama-sama belajar pada malam hari ini. Dan biarlah kesempatan belajar ini pun menjadi suatu persekutuan rohani bagi kami. Dan biarlah di tengah-tengah persekutuan rohani kami, Dikau juga hadir dan memberkati kami. Kami berdoa untuk Profesor Burge, dan biarlah Tuhan sendiri juga terus menyertai dan memakai anakmu ini untuk boleh menjadi berkat bagi kami semua dan menolong kami untuk semakin mengerti bagian-bagian dari kebenaran firman-Mu dan konteks yang melatar belakanginya. Inilah doa kami, inilah permohonan kami. Di dalam nama Tuhan Yesus Kristus kami berdoa. Amin.
Thank you, Reverend Yohanes Budi. I would like to request Johnny to share the slide again. We're gonna read, and I will lead you for the lecture protocol. Okay, please, the committee kindly request all of you to rename, your name in the Zoom with the following format. You put your name, and then your school and your region. And we give you the example, like Joko from STTAA, Jakarta. Please kindly rename your names. Okay. About the question and answer, we only receive written questions. Yeah. And all those questions shall be directed or texted to Johnny/Q&A. All right, so only to Johnny/Q&A. And when we come to the Q&A session, I will read from Johnny Q&A. Okay. And also you can ask questions in both English or Indonesian, even during the lecture. Yeah. Okay, next. Okay, the committee also will provide a certificate, all right? Well, all participants will get a certificate of completion, will be signed by professor himself, but with conditions, yeah, with these conditions. First, whoever wants to get the e-certificate shall submit a 1,000-word, 1.5 space essay paper, can be in English or Indonesian, from the following passages. In the next slide, we will give the passages later on before the break to this email, rasnitaginting@gmail.com, or to her mobile phone, no later than October 29th. So next week, on the 22nd, we will be having the second lecture from Professor, but we will wait for your submission until October 29th, 2021. And I will repeat, it can be in English or Indonesian, all right? And then the second prerequisite is the full attendance, yeah, for you on the 15th and the 22nd of October, all right, by filling in the attendance form we will provide to you. And then we kindly request your lecturer from your school, all right, to review your essay before submitting to us, all right? And you can give like a digital sign that your lecturer has reviewed. Okay, next. Okay, it's an honor for me that I will introduce our lecturer tonight, Professor Gary M. Burge from Calvin Seminary, Grand Rapids, Michigan, United States. He's a professor of New Testament and the dean of the faculty at Calvin Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan, USA. He is originally from Southern California, and he had an undergraduate at the University of California, Riverside, and the American University of Beirut, Lebanon. He attended Fuller Theological Seminary and King's College, the University of Aberdeen, Scotland. In Scotland, he studied with the famous Howard Marshall, earning a Ph.D. in New Testament. He served on the faculties of King College, Tennessee, North Park University, Illinois, and after 25 years at Wheaton College, Illinois, he joined the faculty of Calvin Theological Seminary, Michigan in 2017. Professor speaks widely in churches and conferences, both in the United States and various countries. He has traveled extensively, particularly in the Middle East. He is ordained in the Presbyterian Church, USA, and served as a military chaplain, USNR. For over 15 years, he was a regular teacher at Willow Church in Barrington, Illinois. Without further ado, Professor, the lecture is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Carlo. It's wonderful to be with you. I've been looking forward to joining each of you for a long time. And honestly, I have just enjoyed so much just getting to know more about Indonesia and about everything from the size of the church in Indonesia, the size of your country. I've always known that Indonesia is huge and it has more islands than I can count. But also I had no idea that the church was as large and as strong as it is. So your presence here is a testimony to that. And someday I am looking forward to coming and visiting Jakarta and many other cities if God so wills. Well, I am going to share my screen right now, and this is going to get us underway. You should be able to see this momentarily. This screen, what it simply does is this will follow the lecture really with a screen, so that will give you some idea of our progress. Now, as you've heard, I teach New Testament studies, and I have taught New Testament studies for a very long time. And I have described the background and culture of the New Testament with students, and they often ask me, well, what is the point? Why do we do something like this? And the point is that when we open the scriptures, we want to do what we call contextual exegesis. And I want to take a couple of minutes at the beginning to explain why we are doing what we're doing. Exegesis is, of course, simply the exercise of drawing the meaning, exago in Greek, we draw the meaning out of a text. But when we do that, we want to be sensitive to the context where that story came from. And so therefore, what I want to do is just explain to you what are the tools that you and I want to have if we're going to do a good job with contextual exegesis. You and I know that context matters. We know this instinctively. If I wanted to describe a story perhaps that came out of Indonesia or a story that came out of Chicago in America here, I would have to realize that the story is going to carry with it assumptions about where it comes from. In Chicago, if you don't know some of the codes which come from American culture, you're going to miss a great deal. And I am confident, 100% confident, that if you told me stories coming out of Jakarta, I would have the same problem. You would have to explain to me codes which are inside of that story. One time I was teaching in Central Africa, and I was in northern Zambia, and I knew that the students were working hard to understand the codes in my American speech. And so I asked each of them to write out a story which had been told to them about from their grandparents. It was a great exercise. And I said, make it a parable. We were studying the parables of Jesus. So I said, I want to hear a parable. Anyway, these Zambian Central African students, they were really great. Half of the stories they gave to me were about a lion and an antelope. So an antelope is just a herd animal that's in the central plains of Africa, and a lion everyone knows. So anyway, and every story was about the wise antelope and the stupid antelope. The wise antelope stays in the hills near its parents. The stupid antelope runs away and then becomes lunch for the lion. And there are so many variations on this. And I thought to myself, there's a perfect example. Here I am receiving Central African parables, which are very foreign to me culturally, And my students just had the most fun time explaining all of the codes inside of their stories. So it's the same with us. If we are holding the New Testament, we are holding a book which is 2,000 years old. We are holding a book which comes from a completely foreign culture, and we cannot assume to understand the codes which are inside. Take, for instance, this beautiful and amazing sculpture here of Zeus, the leading god of the Greek pantheon. I would imagine that, first of all, you wouldn't know this, but it was painted. So whenever we see these things, and they're always gray like this, that's not it originally. They actually were beautifully painted. But anyone in the ancient world would have recognized this immediately and said, yes, that's Zeus. I wonder how many of us have the same ability. Now, there are three things that we need to know if we're going to be effective in interpreting the context of the New Testament. The first thing is land. You and I need to know land. Land is always, location is always embedded in every story. We need to know where things happened. If I were telling a historical story of some kind in the United States, you may or may not know that there is an enormous difference between Texas and Washington, D.C., an enormous difference between California and New York. So therefore, when it comes to a place like, well, I don't know, Southeast Asia or something, I could say, is there a cultural difference between the Philippines and Indonesia? What about Vietnam and Cambodia? What about China and Korea? So where are these places? Where are they located on the map? And what does it mean when people identify themselves and tell a story about those places? Place makes a difference. It really does. When Jesus says, I'm a Galilean, or his followers say they are Galileans, that means something important. If a person in the first century said, I'm a Judean, I am from the area around Jerusalem, that's important. He's signaling something to you. So anyway, here, for example, I've given you a picture of Herod's new harbor at Caesarea Maritima. Anyone who goes to Israel today is going to have a nice tour of this. But you can see, here's a nice theater, which Herod built. This was a magnificent thing. And you have to ask yourself, it's on the coast of the Mediterranean. Why did he build? Here's the harbor right up here. Why did he build this harbor? Here's a horse racing track for entertainment. It's just a remarkable thing, though. He built this harbor because he wanted to be connected to the West, to Rome and to Greece. This is the first time that Israel had ever had what was called a deep water harbor on the West coast. And that is so that Roman galleons could come in and anchor there, bring in goods, bring in military, and so forth. So anyway, I have got to know the land. I definitely need to know the land. And every story is going to assume that you know the land. So let's take a look here at John 6. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Now, right away, he's assuming that you know what the Sea of Galilee is. You know that it's also called the Sea of Tiberias. So how does that work? Look at verse 3. Jesus went up onto a mountain and sat there with his disciples. There are mountains near Galilee. There's mountains near Capernaum. There are. So you and I, it's assumed you're going to know something about the geography of this place. Look at this paragraph from Acts chapter 13, beginning at verse 13. Now, Paul and his company set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia. And John left them and returned to Jerusalem, but they passed on from Perga and came to Antioch in Pisidia. And on the Sabbath day, they went into the synagogue and sat down. Now, if you're somebody from Jakarta or Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I live, and you don't have any idea where these places are, you'll just skip right over these things. But to Paul and his readers, these places were important. They knew them like the back of their hand. Geography is the playing board on which history is played. So the biblical stories are doing the very, very same thing. If I read the Old Testament and I don't know, when I read in the book of Joshua and I read about the conquest, geography plays a primary role. When I look at the allocation of the tribes of Israel inside of Israel, where do the tribes go? The location of those tribes tells me a great deal about who has privileges. Same is true in the New Testament. Do we have some idea about what it means to be like Paul from Tarsus or like someone else who comes from, say, Galilee or Jerusalem? All right, so that's the first idea. You and I need to know the land. The second thing is that whenever we reconstruct a story, we have to know some of the history that is surrounding that story. Every story, every person, let's put it that way, every era has things that are swirling around it that that really do influence what is going on in that period of time. I think about the 20th century, and I think about my parents. My father happened to be in World War II. He happened to be in Southeast Asia, and I think about if you told me the story of my father's life, but did not understand World War II, it would be a completely inadequate story. If you told me the story of maybe the 1960s, an important decade for me, and you did not tell about the war in Vietnam, or you did not also understand what it meant to have a revolution and everything from rock music to sexuality, I didn't understand those things, it would really be a deficient story. And I'm sure the same is true in your culture. At Calvin Seminary, we have many, many international students. And later we're going to talk about how maybe you can become one of them. But we have a lot of Korean students. We have a lot of Chinese students. We have had Indonesian students. But anyway, I really love hanging out with these people, because with my Korean students, I have not only learned, of course, what it means to have North Korea and South Korea there so close to each other, but the conflict, the history of that conflict is enormous. I did not understand the Japanese occupation of Korea in the early 20th century and what that means for Koreans. So anyway, if I neglect the history, if I don't know the history of what's going on around, you really can't represent the way people's lives have worked. Now, here is a speech given in Acts chapter 5, and it presumes you know something about rebellion. Men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed, and all his followers, they were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. And then after him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and all his followers were scattered. Therefore, in the present day, I advise you, leave these men alone, let them go. Now, okay, aside from what the message is of this speech, the thing that I want to point out to you is that the speech presumes you know something about this guy named Theudas and his 400 men who tried to run an insurrection. Theudas got killed. And then it assumes you know something about Judas the Galilean. Now, what is this? Anybody living in the first century realized that there were rebellions going on regularly. And therefore, there's a kind of political churn happening inside of first century life. These are simply code phrases that tell you, here are two rebels. Everybody knows their name. Everybody knows their stories. And beware. Beware, because we may be in a similar situation. You know, when I think about my own history here in the United States, you may or you may not know, but in January 6th, there was a rebellion in Washington in which thousands of people hoped to take over the American Capitol. The story was followed pretty well worldwide because, you know, right now, this is a significant bit of American history. However, when we look at it, we think, really? Today in my country, all I have to do is say January 6th. I don't have to explain it. All I have to say is remember January 6th. And people fill in the entire story of what goes on there. So the same thing happened in the first century. All right, so first we said it's important to know the land. Secondly, it's important to know something of the history surrounding that land. And then thirdly, it's important to know the culture and how people live. This is a beautiful Awasi sheep, and these sheep are desert sheep, and they are living all over the Middle East, North Africa. And people have tried to bring them to Ireland, and they do well in New Zealand and Australia as well. But they're beautiful, really beautiful sheep. Now, how can I get at a story if I don't know that story's culture? It's a really fair question. If you and I live with assumptions about culture every single day. In fact, some people think that humor is so deeply embedded in culture that jokes only work when you're talking to people who share your culture. I know this with firsthand experience, because in a class full of international students, if I say something funny, only the Americans laugh. But the rest of my students, they don't quite understand the humor. And that's because humor usually is carrying a great deal of cultural baggage. So you and I, if we're going to open these stories, we need to be able to ask, well, do you know how bread is baked? Do you know the relationship between fathers and sons? Do you know the relationship assumed between slaves and slave owners? Do we have any idea about how fishing and sheep herding and all of these things worked? Because those assumptions are embedded in our stories. I want to give you an example of this with a story that you will already know. It's in Luke 7, and it is so full of cultural assumptions that most preachers get it wrong. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. Now, right away, I can see this is a social event. The Pharisees are inviting men and men only, no women here. And they are reclining at table. This is a good translation. They don't sit at table, they recline. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. Hold on. So this woman is going to try to get into the home somehow of the Pharisee's house, which is filled with dignified men all eating and talking theology. As she stood behind Jesus at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. What? I cannot understand what's going on here. If I'm thinking in Western terms, I'm wondering if she is crawling under the table. How can this be? But how does it that she has access to his feet? Well, what I have to know is that he's reclining. Reclining on one elbow is the way it works, eating with his opposite hand. And she has come up behind him, and they're likely in a patio courtyard. I can explain all of this only because I know how people ate and how they lived in their homes, and how the public was invited to walk into the courtyard and surround the group and listen in on this brilliant conversation going on. But this is a woman who has a very, very unfortunate history. And so therefore she is carrying perfume that she no doubt uses for herself. So when the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said, if this man were a prophet, he would know who was touching him. Now, this is an interesting thing. In Greek, there's a couple of ways I can say if. I could say to all of you, if you are Indonesian, you will understand where Jakarta is. Well, there's no uncertainty there. I could also say, since you're Indonesian, you know where Jakarta is. But there's another way in Greek that I can say if, and it's unsure if you are what I'm describing. All right? So it's a questionable if. So if, and I don't think it's true, this man were a prophet, so the host is insulting Jesus, he would know who is touching him. And that is the last word I want to point out to you. So therefore, touching, the word here actually he uses is haptomai, and the word is also used for lighting a fire. Now, haptomai, what does it mean? There's a lot of ways in every culture I can talk about touching. But above all, I want you to know two things. There are rules in culture about sexual boundaries. And so therefore, can you touch people you're not married to or related to? Can people touch like that? I mean, there are huge rules, and in the first century, there were rules against this. But touching him, I can hit you, I can pat you, I can push you. There are lots of ways. Every language has lots of words for touching. But this is a word that is also used for starting a fire. And you can imagine. So the host is saying, this is a woman with perfume who is crossing sexual boundaries and touching him suggestively. You see the idea. So therefore, what you have in the story is a lot of codes, code upon code upon code. And I suggest if you lived in America or in Indonesia and didn't understand these codes, you really couldn't understand the story. Here's an example, another example of culture. What about oil lamps? That is a very every archaeologist would know, this is about 1200 BC, an Iron Age oil lamp. You put the oil inside of here, and then you put a piece of cloth or a wick that comes here, it burns and it's sucking up the oil. That's fine. Walking around with this is difficult because it will spill. And so therefore, in the Hellenistic period, they decided to come up with a two-piece oil lamp, and you can see it here. There's the bottom portion, which is made separately from the top portion, and then you pour the oil in here, and then you can see the wick comes out here. And you can walk around with that lamp nicely. Little handle on the back end, which here is broken off. So I get it. That's a much different. I can, if I found that, I knew how to date it. The Jews who had the history of using this kind of oil lamp, but did not necessarily want to be Greek, but they wanted to resist Greek influence, they created this in the first century. And you can see what they've done. They've taken the original oil lamp and they folded over the sides to make a closure, fill it back here, and then the wick comes out here. So what you have here is a mixture of original Jewish oil lamps using the technology of the Greeks in order to keep their own distinctive way of life. Interesting, isn't it? Those are cultural codes. If I asked you, how did people eat? We just talked about that in the previous story with Simon the Pharisee. Now, this is the Lord's Supper. It is the most famous painting of the Lord's Supper. And you, I'm sure, will recognize this. Here is Jesus, and you can see they're all sitting at a long table, and it is wrong in so many ways. The clothing is wrong. The color of the clothing is wrong. What's on the table is wrong. There's even a dog under the table. There's a tablecloth even. This is a European picture. That's what it is. But what if I said to you, this is the way that people ate? Eating on the floor was common, and it's common today. I've eaten on the floor on beautiful carpets many times in homes in the Middle East. So here you have a low table, three-sided. The Romans invented this. It's called the triclinium. And you can see that everybody sits around the edge, and you can see each other. It's a really wonderful setup. And servants come into the middle, and they serve the table, okay? Now, here in Pompeii is a triclinium without its cushions. Now you can see, here it is here. You step into the triclinium. It is elevated, which is a very high-class triclinium. There has to be cushions here. You can see the cushions will be all around the outside. Everybody can see each other, maybe a decorative piece in the middle here. You can see how this is laid out. It's a wonderful, this is a dining room. So consequently, Jews loved this, and they adopted this. When I reconstruct the story of Jesus in the upper room, that's what I should think about. I said to you that woman was carrying an alabaster jar. What comes into your mind when you think about an alabaster jar? I can show you this. Here are museum pieces. These are alabaster jars. All right. So contextual exegesis is an attempt to say that we must read a text through its context. And if we don't read a text through its context, we will misrepresent that text. So we need to be amateur archaeologists, amateur historians. We need to be linguists. We need to be thoughtful about how we reconstruct this story. I think if I were to put this in the boldest language, it would sound like this. The stories of the New Testament are not timeless. Now, I know that will sound shocking to some of you, but they can't be timeless. An effective story has to be embedded in its time and place. The stories are not timeless. The message of the New Testament is timeless. So therefore, when I work with our stories in the New Testament or the Old Testament, I actually need to extract or lift those stories out of their original setting, and then I can represent them accurately. For some Christians, they hear me say the stories of the New Testament are not timeless, and I simply would have to say, well, if I'm telling a story about the lost sheep and I'm repeating it in the far north, in Alaska maybe, or the Arctic Circle, a place where no one has ever seen a sheep ever, they will have difficulty understanding what the parable of the lost sheep is all about. All right, so what I would like to do today is I want us to explore the political and historical world which was all around the New Testament. And that's what we'll do until we take our break. And I'm assuming that we will have a break here in about 15 minutes. And then I also want to talk about the values which they would have understood were in their lives as they read and wrote the New Testament. When I use the word Hellenism, we need to make sure that we know what the word means from its own time. Hellenism, the root word of Hellenism is Hellene, and that is simply the word that means Greek. Greek in the language of Greece is Hellene. If I wanted to say I was Greek, I would say I'm Hellene. So Hellenism is actually a reference to Greek culture, but it's more than that. It's actually a term that we technically use describing the advent of Greek culture into the larger Mediterranean world, beginning with Alexander the Great. And I'll talk about him in a moment. And then it's going all the way through the Roman world. Now, why do we do this? Hellenistic culture, Greek culture, was so infectious, so enticing, so interesting that the Greek culture spread broadly all over the Mediterranean world. The Roman conquest of that same world in the 1st century BC was a political and military conquest. And so therefore, people like to say this, think about it this way. The Romans conquered the Greeks, but the Greeks converted the Romans. So in other words, when you are in the Roman Empire, you may well be speaking Greek, a form of Hellenistic Greek. We can talk about that as well. So it's almost as if, think about Hellenism as Western culture. Western culture almost spreads like a virus. Here I am coming from the West telling you the truth. But I mean, if I'm in Jakarta or Manila, or if I'm in Seoul, I suspect I might find a Starbucks, a McDonald's, a Kentucky Fried KFC, and maybe a Pizza Hut. Maybe at the break, you can tell me if you've seen these in Jakarta and how many you've seen. Anyway, I was on a boat in the middle of the Nile in Cairo, Egypt one time, and I thought, oh, this will be romantic and inspiring. And much to my disappointment, there were loud, bright Pizza Hut signs all along the Nile River in Cairo. And I thought, goodness, I have flown so far and I can't get rid of American culture. The largest Starbucks I've ever been in is in Cairo, Egypt. Now, what does that mean? Western culture tends to spread. And even though you would have a culture that wants to hold on to its own identity, like the Koreans want to hold on to their Korean culture, they tell me this, and yet they go to Starbucks. So in a sense, what you have is Hellenistic life is floating almost like a vapor, almost like a fog or smoke. It is moving through the entire Mediterranean, even though the Romans are in charge. Now, in order for us to have a clear sense of what's happening politically, I've got to just reach back into the Old Testament and remind you where we have been. If you wanted to talk about biblical history in the Old Testament period, right up until, the intertestamental period, you would talk about Eastern empires. By Eastern, I'm talking about Egypt. I'm talking about Mesopotamia, Babylon, and Assyria. And I'm talking about Persia. So therefore, if you lived in Jerusalem and you thought about your own history, anywhere from, say, 2000 BC up until, I don't know, AD 300, you would have your orientation toward the East. Now, as you know, the Persian Empire, the fourth of those four, the Persian Empire succeeded in conquering the Babylonians. And all of those countries that were living in Babylon, that had been taken to Babylon, like the Jews, they saw the Persians as emancipators. And in fact, the Persians just unraveled the Babylonian Empire and it fell. It had been overextended. But like with any empire that's ever existed at any time, in any place in the world, ambition can be its undoing. So the Persian Empire actually reached all the way into Egypt. It reached all the way up here. This is Asia Minor, or today it's Turkey, but it reached all up into these northern areas. Today it's Kurdistan and northern Iraq. But above all, this is the line I want you to see. It reached all the way to Greece. Can you believe it? And northern Greece is called Macedonia. Now, as the Army likes to say, the military sort of lives it moves on its belly. In other words, the saying means you can equip soldiers with swords and chariots and horses and all of that, but if you can't feed them and you can't clothe them and they don't sleep well, your army is going to fall apart, which is why every military knows your supply chain is everything. Now, in the ancient world, they don't have trains, trucks, ships. They don't have any of this stuff. The further you go out, the weaker your supply chain becomes. And by the time the Persians were controlling Macedonia, they had hit a culture that was strong and unified, and they were willing to resist. The Persians were overextended, and the Macedonians were going to take advantage of that. And here's the man who does it, Alexander the Great. His father, Philip, is a regional ruler in Macedonia. Philip is a brilliant young man, a tactician, and they organize themselves very effectively, and they successfully defeat the Persian armies in Macedonia. But as I said to you before, every empire has ambitions, and that's true of Alexander the Great as well. So what happens is he leaves Macedonia with a relatively small army, and there's an incredibly important battle that takes place right here in 333 BC, the Battle of Issus. And here at this battle, it was a time when he actually confronts the Persian army. The Persians understand that if he is successful, he'll go all the way down and he will end up taking all of Mesopotamia, and he'll also go and take Egypt. Huge, huge battle here. And what happened was that Alexander the Great had done some important things. He had trained soldiers, he had trained horses, and he had a breed of horse that was incredibly large. He had armored horses. People did not arm their horses, put shields on them and things forever, really. And then his infantry carried what was a very, very long lance. It was a spear. And when two armies meet each other, the guy with the longest spear is the guy who wins. Use your imagination. So what Alexander did was he actually created the first fast armored cavalry. So imagine if you were an infantry line of soldiers and you were expecting that in normal warfare, two infantry lines would hit each other. That's not what Alexander did. What he had was about 500 horses shaped in a triangle, all of them armored, enormous horses, and their riders would have lances on them, and they would be running at full speed like a diamond cutter directly at the Persian line. Well, if you're an infantryman and you see this pounding monster of animals coming at you, fully armored, you're going to run. And Alexander used that fast armored strategy to defeat the Persians here. He went down and he took Egypt fairly easily, and then he makes his way all the way through Persia, and he wins. He goes all the way to the Indus River in India. It's incredible. And essentially, he again overstretches. He comes all the way back and he ends up dying here in the area of Babylon. Now, what does Alexander do? What is his culture like? How it was like? This was an infectious culture. He is bringing sort of a global presence to the entire Mediterranean world. Here's a beautiful coin from his minted in the name of his father, Philip II. And you can see here's the name, if you know Greek, Philip is right here, okay? And you can see the horses of the Macedonians sitting right here. It's a marvelous coin, which shows something of the imperial pride and prowess of these people. Now, one of the things about Alexander and his conquest is Alexander, when he conquers an area, he leaves his culture behind. I'd like to think of the Macedonians as cultural evangelists. I've had some of my students tell me, wherever the Chinese have been, they leave their culture behind. And so therefore we have all these remnants of Chinese culture everywhere in our country. So Vietnamese have told me this. The same thing about America. Where America tends to go militarily, you'll have the remnants of this behind. Alexander, he builds these new cities throughout his conquest. He does. Now, what about the Jews who are living in Israel? Well, first of all, they experience what we call cultural assimilation. they become Hellenistic. They are taking on things that they never took on before. They realize that this is an empire and they have got to speak the language. So they begin using Greek. Well, that's the second thing. They do begin using Greek, but during this period, the Greek is not the pure Greek of Athens. When language spreads out into other countries that are far away from their homeland, they take on regional dialects. So it's just like English. If you hear English spoken in Hong Kong and English spoken in London, you might hear something very different. English spoken in Sydney, Australia, oh my goodness, it's so different. So the language we refer to is Common Greek, Koine Greek. For a long time, there were people who thought that Koine Greek was somehow special Greek, but it is not. It is simply Greek with a heavy dialect from the region you happen to be in. The New Testament is written in Koine Greek, and that is a legacy of Hellenistic culture coming into the land. Architecture. The Greeks really built major things. They did, and they were able to make large buildings, really impressive buildings. They cut stone. So public architecture is something the Jews really did not do. This was more of a tribal culture in Jerusalem. Well, it wasn't as sophisticated as it would be. Western orientation is a very interesting idea. Suddenly for the Jews, they realized that their enemy or their possibilities were not to the east, to Persia, Mesopotamia, Egypt. It is going to be to the west. And they had never had that orientation before. They were being exposed to an empire, imperial exposure, I call it. They see that there is an empire, a multilingual empire developing all over the Mediterranean world, and they have to choose, do we be a part of it or do we fight against it? Now, for the Jews, probably the most significant development is, I would say, is that the Old Testament, the Torah, is translated into Greek. Now, this idea is scandalous. It is scandalous to a Jew, if you're conservative, because you think to yourself, God revealed his word in Hebrew to Moses, and isn't God's language Hebrew? So what are we doing putting it into Greek? The reality is, during the 100 years following Alexander, Jews began losing their capacity in Greek. So therefore, you have this Greek translation. And they also took in books written in the intertestamental period, the Apocrypha, we call them. So these books all come together. Now, why do I point this out to you? In the New Testament period, the Septuagint, this Greek translation done by traditionally 70 scholars, that's why it's called Septuagint, this is the Bible that is quoted in the New Testament when you find Paul quoting from the Old Testament. 75% of the quotes from the Old Testament in the New Testament are coming from the Septuagint. That's how common it was. They saw the Septuagint as God's word. Here's the other thing that comes out of this period. You would recognize, I hope, this map of Israel close up. And here you can see is the Dead Sea, and here's the Mediterranean Sea. But this region just north of Jerusalem, here's Jerusalem and this red dot. Here is Samaria, or this is supposed to be Shechem. Anyway, this area here is the Samaritan area. This is the Jewish area, Judean area. And they had a lot of conflict, a great deal of conflict. When Alexander and the Hellenistic troops came into this area, because there was so much resentment, these people welcomed Alexander and his generals, while the Jews resisted more. This meant that these people were sympathetic with foreign occupation because they thought it was a way to defeat their opponents. When I come to the New Testament, I'm going to find out that the Temple of Samaria on Mount Gerizim and the Temple of Jerusalem, they are going to be rival temples. In John chapter 4, Jesus even brings this up when he's talking to the woman of Samaria. So a lot of hostilities. The parable of the Good Samaritan, if you don't know that the Samaritans up here are to be hated by the Jews who are here in Judea or up in Galilee, you would miss the meaning of that story. Let me underscore just a couple of more things about a cultural assimilation that you might find to be entertaining, but I think they're nice symbols. I think that in every culture, I wonder about you in Indonesia, young people like to take on the clothes that annoy their parents. Is that true of you in Indonesia or not? In other words, do they want to cut their hair, and do they want to wear clothes that says, look, I'm different, I'm modern, that kind of thing, okay? Well, anyway, we have Jewish texts talking about how young people especially wanted to take on the Jewish way, the Greek way, the Hellenistic way of life. And so not only was language involved here, but things like clothing. I give you, this is a coin, and this has a petasos on it. This guy, now a Jewish head covering, actually draped over your head and fell to your shoulders. But this, look at this hat. It has a stiff rim on it. It has a little ball on the top. Do you see that hat? No Jew would wear that hat, except in the Hellenistic period. This is called the Helios hat. It is round with that stiff rim, and it was the fashion of the day. Let me give you another example. Jews are modest in this period in their clothing. They would wear a robe that would fall from their shoulders to their ankles, and then they would wear sandals. But the Hellenists, they didn't like, that was too heavy, it was too hot. This is the Mediterranean. They wore shorter togas. They fell down to your knee, and then you wore sandals that were strapped all the way up to your knee. So to the older generation, provocative, problematic. Okay, so what do you do with that? Jerusalem in this time began building theaters. The Jews had no theaters. They began building horse racing tracks. The Jews had nothing like this. And so we have in the Apocrypha in First Maccabees descriptions, complaints of rabbis saying, our young people are going to the discus and gymnasiums. They're wearing these clothes. What are we going to do with them? Here's the most astonishing thing of all. Inside of the athletic gymnasiums of this period, men would compete in the nude. They were naked. And so, as you know, Jews circumcise, and so therefore the removal of the foreskin of the penis really becomes quite visible if you put a group of men together. Greeks and Romans, they thought it was a terrible idea. They did not do this. So when young Jewish men tried to get involved in the Greek gymnasiums, they were embarrassed that they were circumcised. And we know that Jews began to stop circumcising their sons. Now, that's astonishing. And there are complaints about this all through this period. The last thing I want to mention, then we'll take a break, is diversity, recognition, and tolerance. I think that Judaism was living a fairly insular, closed life. They kept to themselves, they protected their culture. But it wasn't true from the Hellenistic period on. They began to see the world as a bigger place. And coming with that, you either will fight against it or you will grow in your sense of tolerance. Their tolerance began to grow, and Jews began to decide they don't have to live in Israel to be a successful Jew. And therefore, what happens in the Hellenistic era is Jews begin to migrate. They migrate into the Mediterranean world, and we find Jewish communities living all around the Mediterranean. Now, this is why Paul can travel around the Mediterranean and he will be able to speak to Jewish communities. They are over 200 years old. Now, this is a good place for us to stop. I'm looking at the clock and I'm going to sort of discontinue sharing right now. And I think that we have time for a break here. Josephat, am I right about that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Or Carlo?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
is this a time for us to break?
No, the break. Question and answer.
Okay, question and answer. Sorry.
Okay. Just want to inform brothers and sisters here, the participants, that please raise your questions to Joni/Q&A, and you can raise your questions either in Indonesian or English, ya, bisa dalam bahasa Indonesia dan bahasa Inggris. Am I Americanized, Gary? Okay.
You tell me.
Yeah, we have McDonald's, we have which I'm a little bit, what to say, jealous that you said that the Starbucks, the biggest Starbucks is in Nile. Go.
No, that's only the one I have seen. That's the only one I've been in. So is there a bigger one in Jakarta?
I think so, yeah. Brothers and sisters can better say. All right.
I
Okay.
ask my Korean students if I said, so you like to drink coffee? And they say, absolutely. I said, what? Wait a minute. You should not drink coffee. You should be drinking tea. Where did this idea of drinking coffee come from? And they go, well, we've always drank coffee in Korea. Oh, come on. So anyway, it's really funny how coffee is the cultural drug of the West.
Okay, now we already have the first question, Professor. So, Professor Burge, can you please explain how context of how the context could influence our context today? I mean, but in reading the Bible, I mean the relationship between biblical theology with systematic theology. Pierre Gilbert said that the ultimate aim of the hermeneutical enterprise is meaningful, effective, and life-transforming communication. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, very good question. It's an excellent question. Thank you for asking it. I think you have to begin with this presupposition that that revelation necessarily has to be embedded in a cultural context. So therefore, when God presents himself in our world, he must take up the clothing of our world. It's necessary, or he becomes incomprehensible to us. So therefore, when he speaks to Moses, he speaks from a burning bush. That seems completely odd to me, but I have to understand it in its own context. So that's the assumption I have here. So therefore, if stories are only understandable if they are told inside of the context of the listener, and I am a foreigner, here's the major idea, that I am a foreigner when I am visiting the stories of the Bible. That's what you really have to get your mind around, that idea. I am a foreigner when I'm coming to read the stories of the Bible. Now, it doesn't mean that you're an outsider, because God has invited you and accompanies you with his Holy Spirit to be able to extract the message of that story so that you can take it into your theology and into your church. But that means then that I have a story inside of the Bible which has at its very heart a vital message for me, and yet it is encased, it is living inside of a wrapper. And in some manner, I have to slip that wrapper off or explain that wrapper very carefully in order for me to get to the very center of the story. Take the parable of the prodigal son. In Luke 15, everyone knows that story, the parable of the prodigal son. However, I suggest to you that if I read that parable using American cultural assumptions, I will utterly represent that parable. Because I have assumptions about money and estates and fathers and sons and death and respect and honor that are completely different than the biblical world. So therefore, I have to work with the parable of the prodigal son, and I have to become, you might say, an anthropologist, really, a cultural anthropologist. And I need to therefore understand the wrapping around that story in order for me to accurately extract its truth. So that truth, which is sitting inside of the story, is what is revelatory and significant for me. The heart of my theology comes from the heart of that story. Revelation is embedded in culture. Culture, it's not necessarily inspired. It's the story which is packaged into that culture, which is.
Thank you. So, quick question. In Jesus' time, which Bible did he read? Which scripture did he read? Example, in Luke 4:17, was it Septuagint or the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, exactly. Very good question. So I would suggest there's scholarly debate about this. The question is always framed is, did Jesus know Greek? It's a great question. My assumption is that his use of Greek was minimal. I'm from Southern California, and his use of Greek is about like my use of Spanish. It's everywhere inside of the culture, even though I am not fluent in it. I can't even speak Spanish. I can't. But there are 100 at least Spanish words that I use all of the time when I'm in the Southwest of America. So my assumption is that Jesus is actually using a Hebrew text, and in many cases, he is using a popular translation of that Hebrew text in another Semitic language called Aramaic. So he is likely, though, inside of a synagogue, when he's reading in a synagogue, as he does in Luke 4, I think he has a Hebrew Torah in front of him, because that was understood to be the right way to do it. He would be reading from Hebrew. Was he bilingual? He's not, doesn't have to be bilingual. He's from Mountain Galilee. And in that area, the Hellenistic culture is present, but not dominant.
Okay, next question. Is the contextual exegesis the same or stemmed from textual deconstruction? If not, will you explain the distinction?
Yeah, I'm not sure. The questioner has to tell me what they mean by textual deconstruction. So I'm not sure exactly what they're intending there.
Okay, so please elaborate if brothers or sisters are raising this question. Could you elaborate and send again to Johnny Q&A? Okay, Shalom, I'm Riondo from STTB The Way, Jakarta, for Professor. We know in this condition, the world, how we can effectively impact this world in the urban life area culture because of disruption condition, how we can do in a Greco-Roman world of the New Testament era. How can we mentally imagine about that in our culture now socially?
Let me see. I'm going to take a shot at this. I think you're asking if you're living in a modern environment like Jakarta, how is it that we can imagine the world of the ancient times and actually make use of it? Exactly right. Jews have no problem answering that question if you're in a synagogue today. They say, you have to time travel. You have to learn ancient culture. Christians tend to be more reluctant to say that because we want to say the word of God just simply will speak its truth to us without any help. But the word of God, as it's written on our pages, is an incarnational word, which is embedded in a culture. So therefore, we need help. We need to become time travelers. And so therefore, we need to have books. We need to actually, we're doing this lecture right now for that very reason. We need assistance as we begin to do this kind of thing. So for instance, there's one author that I would love to recommend to you. His name is Craig Keener. Has Craig done things with you before?
Back in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
Right. Craig is a dear friend of mine, and Craig is a New Testament scholar who is in the state of Kentucky here. Yeah. But Craig has a 1-volume, cultural commentary on the entire New Testament. Has about 1,000 words in it, 1,000 pages in it, and it's enormous. And what Craig does in this 1 volume is he gives you a lot of the cultural codes. So I find that when I am presenting some of these stories, these passages in church, in a modern setting like Jakarta, people enjoy hearing these cultural ideas, like how people ate meals and what it means to touch and what an alabaster flask looks like. And so therefore, when I take my audience back in time and I explain the history and the politics and everything, they love it. They can understand that because they do it all the time. Whenever they watch a movie that represents a different era than we live in, they're doing that time traveling to understand and enjoy the movie. So that's what I think I have to do in a modern setting. We as moderns have a sense of history, which is actually uncommon in human history. We have a sense that people 2,000 years ago dressed differently, acted differently, spoke differently, and that has not always been true of humans who have thought about the past.
Two more questions before we break. Okay, this one I think is in relation with your lecture. Which event or events during the Hellenistic period that shaped significantly the way the Jews worldview at that time? For example, let's say how Americans have the event of Pearl Harbor or 9/11 shaped
sure.
a lot of how Americans place themselves in the world affairs.
Nice question. That's a very sweet question. There's a couple. The arrival of Alexander the Great in 332 BC, huge, absolutely huge. The people who were living in Jerusalem when the city actually was controlled by the Greeks had no idea how big that would be. They just thought this was a passing empire. It would change the next 500 years. That's the first. The second is the coming of the Romans in 63 BC. That was absolutely enormous because here now was a culture that was going to be much more dominant than the Greeks, and they're going to take over the politics of the country. They really will. All right, that's the second one, 63 BC. The third one is undoubtedly the most important with reference to Judaism, and that is AD 70. AD 70 is the conclusion of what we call the First Jewish War. And as you might know, the temple is central to everything about Jewish life and faith. And Jerusalem is attacked by the Romans, and the temple is completely destroyed in AD 70. Okay, it's about a 3-year, 4-year war. Now, when you think about it, if you were Jewish living in the first century, and your temple in your city, geographical location is very central to Jewish life and identity. Just like with your Muslim friends, Mecca is central. There's a sense of geography that comes with it. Arabia, Mecca, Islam has that. Judaism has that as well. Jerusalem, the temple, that location. By the way, Christians don't have that same idea. So anyway, the destruction of the temple is the equivalent of a nuclear bomb going off in Washington, D.C. It would be hard for people to think about how they can reconstruct their life. And so for Jews, it's their culture is destroyed. It's like, how do I do this? And so therefore you have the development of a different kind of Judaism that kind of pours out of that period. So anyway, for me, it's the first arrival of the Greeks, it is the arrival of the Romans, and then the destruction of the temple. Those would be the 9/11s of this period.
Okay, thank you. Last question before we break, because you mentioned about how the youngsters at that time, they were influenced the way they dress, wearing the hat.
Oh, yeah. I thought that would be fun.
I just the question, what about the culture of today's Jewish rabbi? I mean, they wear black long coat and hat that looks like a cowboy's hat. Where do they get that?
From Eastern Europe. From Eastern Europe. So therefore, if you happen to be in Israel or anywhere in the world, really, New York City, doesn't matter. But Hasidic Jews, this is an Eastern European, very much Polish, Russian. This is a whole culture of separation. And so therefore it is the clothing, from the curls to the beard, to the hat, to the black clothing. This is all an attempt to separate yourself from the rest of European culture. That clothing is not the way they dressed 2,000 years ago. There's no connection to that whatsoever. But in every period of time, every religious community says, how should we behave? How should we dress to indicate who we are? And I'm sure that there are some Christians in Indonesia that say, I will not wear this, but I will wear that in order to indicate that I'm a spiritual person.
Probably one question for me, just
Yeah.
How did Jesus dress, or how did Peter or Paul dress?
Yeah, good. It's a great question. I can tell you, we know this because actually we have a painting. The only visual depiction we have comes from a couple of hundred years after them, and it's on some walls in northern Syria in a place called Dura Europos. Anyway, yeah, I can just tell you, they did not cut their hair. They kept their hair long. Okay, so we'll just go from the top to the bottom. They kept their hair long. Romans and Greeks like to cut their hair.
Yeah.
Romans and Greeks, they did like to shave. They did like to shave or have a very tight, short beard. So the idea of a long beard would have been very common. Okay. And then they would wear an outer garment that would just fall from the shoulders all the way to the ground. And underneath it, you would wear a loincloth. They did have underwear, but it would be kind of a wrapping cloth that would actually tie underneath. Now, in the wintertime, or if you were wealthy, the outer garment was made of wool. And if you've ever worn something heavy in wool, that's not terribly comfortable. So therefore, they also had an inner lining they could wear if you were lucky. And that inner lining was a very fine linen fabric that sort of was against your skin and felt really very comfortable. So that's what it was. And you didn't own a lot of clothes. They didn't have closets. So people wore the same thing all the time. And that outer wool cloak was on the outside, became, for poor people, a blanket they slept with.
Well, thank you, brothers and sisters. Thank you for Professor that we just passed our first session, the first half of tonight's lecture, the Greco-Roman world of Jesus and Paul. Stay tuned. All right, Johnny, could you show again the slides? Just a couple of information before we break. Thank you, Johnny, please. I want to talk about the assignments for brothers and sisters to get the e-certificate from you, Gary.
All right.
Okay. Johnny, could you mind sharing the screen? Okay, I think, okay, here it's going in. Okay, so these are the selections for brothers and sisters for the assignments of essay paper. I mean, and again, I would like to remind this, if you want to get the e-certificate signed by a professor, then this is the first the first option. Okay, look at, and this is from Professor. Look at Matthew 2:1-6. This is what Herod's counselors are telling him about the coming Messiah. If you read this passage, thinking about the politics of Rome and Judea, what is the text really saying? Now look elsewhere in the nativity story. What other signals do you see of the contemporary scene? When Jesus is called Son of God, how might others understand this claim? This is option number one. The second one, Johnny, please. Okay, the second option, read John 6:1-59. What would you need to know about ancient Judaism and the Old Testament in order to understand this passage? When Jesus walks on the sea, what Old Testament images does it recall? When Jesus feeds the 5,000, what would a learned Jew understand? How does Jesus both employ and exploit these Old Testament ideas? Option number three. In Colossians 1:15, Paul writes that Jesus is the image of the invincible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created. Paul is here locating Jesus within the framework of Greek and Roman thinking, and it is provocative, given the dualism of the Hellenistic world, where material reality and heavenly reality never mix. What is Paul saying, and what would his audiences hear? What are the implications that set Christian theology apart from Hellenistic thinking? That's option number three. You just pick or select from one of the passages provided by professor, and you just make the 1,000 word 1.5 space essay. Okay, we're gonna take a break. Please take your coffee or tea, brothers and sisters. Now is 21 past 20. All right, jam 22.1. We're gonna be back for, I think we can cut, yeah, Yusuf, the break for 5 minutes because you were.
Yes,
okay?
yes, yeah.
Okay, so
we will have a break for 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, so we will come back, brothers and sisters, in 8:26 p.m. See you in another 5 minutes. And Johnny, please run the slideshow for information from Sola Scriptura. Thank you. See you. Okay, we will be starting in a minute. Okay. Did you take a cup of coffee?
Yes.
Okay, good.
It's still morning here, so.
Yeah, I just have water. All right. Okay. Okay, here we go. All right, brothers and sisters, welcome back. The second half of our lecture today, given by Professor Gary Burge, is the same, Greco-Roman world of Jesus and Paul. Professor, your time.
Right, thank you. Once again, I'm going to share my screen so that you'll be able to follow me fairly carefully. So last time when we ended up, I said, okay, so the arrival of the Greeks brought all of these sort of cultural changes to the Greeks, and I thought you would enjoy seeing that hat. Now, when it comes to the death of Alexander the Great, his empire is split up by 4 generals. We really cannot track all of that. This is a detailed history, and I don't think it will serve our purposes. But in the Middle East itself, around Israel, there were 2 empires that evolved from competing generals. One were the Ptolemies, who were in Egypt. And look at this remarkable burial mask. This is actually from this period. That is a good example of how a Greek has assimilated into Egyptian culture and therefore is buried as if he were Egyptian. And then in the north of Israel, there's Syria. This too, the Seleucids, this is a Greek empire. So remember, these are 2 Hellenistic empires. And when I say Egypt and Syria, please don't think that they are Arab countries. Now, the whole story of these empires is, as I said, it's intricate, and the Ptolemaic or Egyptian community, which controls Israel for a long time, is overturned by the Syrians, who are much more aggressive and much less tolerant of all of the minority groups. And I think there's only one character we ought to use as a representative of this intolerance, and that is Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Now, Antiochus was a king who was actually very fearful, and he believed that these minority groups would actually undermine his own rule. And so here we have what I would consider to be a really important coin, because if you take a close-up of the back side of that coin, the front side has his face, but I want you to see what's on his coin. So what we have is a picture of Zeus, the god, okay, and he is holding Nike. And if you can read some Greek, and you can see that Nike holding Nike, and here's Nike, and here's the wreath, the victory wreath, which is going on him. You can see that there. And then now I want you to see this. It's important. Theon is right here. That means God. Epiphaneo means the appearance of a god. So therefore, if you flip the coin over, you can see that here is the head of the pantheon of Greece. And on the other side, you have Antiochus. So in other words, the idea is King Basileo. Then here you have Antiochus's name right here. Who is holding Nike with Zeus. He is the appearance of a god. So you have this idea that somehow Antiochus sees himself as divine, really as divine. And this is almost the beginning of this notion that these imperial rulers in Hellenism have some divine authority. Now, Antiochus the Syrians were very, very intolerant of the Jews, and Antiochus did not like the Jews at all. And in fact, there is what we think of as the great desecration of the temple in 168 BC, where Antiochus had his army come to the Jewish temple, strip the temple, and erect a Hellenistic god inside of the Jewish temple. Now, that kind of thing led to a revolt, the Maccabean revolt, and the Jews rose up very successfully, and they were able to throw the Greeks out of Judea. Now, that's a very important event, because for the first time in centuries, Jews actually had a degree of freedom, of autonomy. And actually, they began to think of themselves as possibly being able to recreate the nation of Israel. Here is a lovely, you should recognize it by now. This is a lamp, a beautiful lamp, actually, a closed lamp, which would be Hellenistic, but it's Jewish. And so you can see a menorah there from the temple. Here's where you can pour in your oil, and here's where your wick comes out. Isn't that a gorgeous? That's a beautiful lamp. Now, what happens, the reason the Jews were successful in overturning Greek rule is not because their army was better than the Greeks, but because Rome was attacking the Seleucids from the west. Because Rome was expanding in the 1st century BC, and their expansion was going to be to the east. And Rome was, I guess you would say, the best militarily organized, the most powerful army the world had ever seen at this time. One general in particular, Pompey, conquers the entire east and conquers Judea in 63 BC. And this is just an enormous shift for everybody in the Middle East. When they saw the coming of the Roman armies, they knew immediately that this was not something that they would ever be able to resist. So Jerusalem falls without a conflict, really. Many, in fact, were wondering inside of Jerusalem whether or not the arrival of the Romans might bring more stability and they could curry favor with the Romans. The Romans, their strategy in their provinces around the empire was to install local rulers. And if the local ruler was faithful, they would keep them in place. If they weren't faithful, they were promptly removed. Now, this is a terribly important development for the New Testament, because it is at this time that the Herodian family is established. It is a family that is local. It's from an area south of Judea, from Idumea. This is a family which knows Jewish politics, but is not sympathetic with Jewish politics. And the Romans think they have their people as soon as they have the Herodians. Now, I'm simply putting this map up to show you what this looked like in about AD 14 or so, because I don't want you to think that Rome is simply a small army that is moving across the landscape. Look at the size of this. This is absolutely remarkable. These purple areas here are called senatorial provinces. They're provinces that are pacified and they are celebrating the Roman way of life. And so they're benefiting economically. But I want you to see these sort of orange colored provinces. Do you see these on the edge? Egypt is here, the province up to the Danube River. This is the area around France and Spain, and the edge of Germany here. These areas are called imperial provinces. They are what you might call problematic provinces. They are where you keep your Roman legions. And Judea, Jerusalem area is considered one of those. They're going to watch it carefully because they don't believe that it has been pacified. Now, the original ruler of the Herodian family, his son is King Herod, or we call him Herod the Great. I thought I'd show you one of his coins, which is nice. You can see Herod right along the side here. So you can see his name located there. Herod the Great, well, who is he? He is an outsider. I said to you that his family actually comes from the south. He's not a part of the ruling families of Jerusalem at all, and he's paranoid. He is paranoid. In fact, he marries about 6 or 7 women and hopes to marry into the dynasty that is ruling Jerusalem, the leading Jewish families, and they all hate him. They really do. In fact, he kills a couple of his sons because he suspects that they are actually plotting against him. His idea is that he loves Rome. He wants to be a Roman client king. He is given the title of king by the Romans. He sends his children to Rome to be educated, but he wants to make Judea into a Roman province. To build this Roman province, he has to tax heavily, and he wants to build construction projects which are on the Roman scale of things. Now, these 4 things that I've just mentioned to you pop up in the New Testament in some interesting ways. The idea that this King Herod would send troops down to Bethlehem to kill a child whose family is calling the Messiah doesn't surprise anyone, because he has done this very thing with his own sons. And if you look at the taxation to build this Roman province, you're going to see in the New Testament references to taxation regularly, because the poor were living just on the edge of poverty. And so therefore, taxation was an enormous burden to them. And taxation is the issue that inspires revolutions. Now, let me give you an example of some of these construction projects. It is Herod who builds this port I mentioned earlier, Caesarea Maritima, and it has one function. This port, this deep water port right in here, the port actually went all the way up to this little cliff right in here. So this has been filled in over the years. But this port right here, you see this dark area that's underneath here, this is the remnants, the port sections that have fallen down. This is for Roman ships. The orientation is west, and he wants to say, you can find a deep water port here in the Eastern Mediterranean that's as big as the port of Rome. He wants to impress, he really does. By the way, one other thing I wanted to say to you is that he builds up here on top of this mountain, this little hill right here, a temple, a Roman temple. Remember, he's from a Jewish background. He builds a Roman temple right up here overlooking the entire port of Caesarea. So as you pulled into Caesarea, you would actually see a Roman temple sitting on top, and you'd think, aha, this is indeed a Roman port. He knows that his province is Jewish, and so therefore he undertakes the reconstruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. This goes on from 20 BC to about AD 63. It employs tens of thousands of people. It is using Roman engineering. So therefore you can see the use of arches throughout. You can see these amazingly carved and beautiful columns that are throughout. It has a porch around the entire outside. And this will give you some sense of scale. Do you see this porch right here? This is called the Royal Porch. It had 160 columns in it, and each column weighed 9 tons. So it's amazing. There were 4 rows of, 40 columns each, 160 columns, 9 tons each. We know this. How do I know this? Because when the city was destroyed in AD 70, this porch was thrown over the top, and we have actually found the remnants down below here. So we're able to easily reconstruct what was there. So he builds a walled city. He builds water sources, aqueducts. An aqueduct comes up from Bethlehem. He puts in a racetrack and theaters. He's trying to say to the Jews, you can have a first-class city, but it may cost you something. Here's the city of Jerusalem. It's an artist's reconstruction, but I think it's helpful. Here's the temple, which is here. Here's the inner temple. Here are the outer courtyards. So this is Herod's reconstruction here. And this is the city. Herod actually built a beautiful palace for himself out here. And here is the aqueduct, which is bringing water in from Bethlehem. It is a city which is deeply religious. Some people have said it isn't a city, it is a temple with a city wrapped around it. And maybe that is a fair way to explain it. After Herod dies, what happens is the Romans are worried. They know that Herod is a very loyal patron, but he has a number of sons, each of whom are ambitious. Here's a coin, by the way, from one of his sons, Antipas. And you can see the symbol of Judea is the palm. And so therefore Antipas stamps this on all of his coins. His name here is on the side, Antipas, but it's very much obscured. Anyway, so Rome is worried. Is this province going to be a problem? And some of his sons say they're going to be as loyal as their father. They were educated in Rome, but others are saying we would like to see a Jewish state. Either way, Judea becomes now an imperial province, which is very closely watched by Rome. Now, to look at how the province was actually divided up, it's helpful to think about what Jesus would have understood in his world. Jesus is from this area of what's called Western Galilee. I've placed a number 1 here. It's on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. It's very, very Jewish, and it is run by a fellow named Herod Antipas. This area also, this purple area here, also belongs to Western Galilee, okay? So that's clear. Herod Philip is a guy who is a son also who has this far northeast section here up in Syria. So it is mostly desert. And Caesarea Philippi is what you've heard of before maybe, and that is of course his capital. And then thirdly, there is the heart of the entire country here. It is around Jerusalem, and this is Archelaus runs this. And so Jesus, therefore, coming from Galilee, under Herod Antipas, when he comes to Judea, he is actually coming under the control of Archelaus. Archelaus was very ambitious, and the Romans did not trust him. And finally, they threw him out, and they put Roman governors in here. So this area here in Jesus' day eventually came to be under Roman governors, And these areas out here were run by Jewish client rulers. The reason I mentioned this area here, Jesus is born under Archelaus, and he's such a violent person. This is the reason the Holy Family moves to Egypt, to get away from Archelaus. And when they come back up from Egypt, they go right past it and they settle in Galilee. So the Roman procurators, the governors, they are going to run the central province around Judea and Jerusalem. Their base is in Caesarea. They are down at the coast because that's a very Roman port. They have their eye on Jerusalem, and a whole series of governors are known to us by name. So we can reconstruct this fairly easily, but the most famous governor is Pontius Pilate. So when we talk about the life of Jesus, we can easily say Jesus grew up under Herod Antipas in Western Galilee, a very Jewish area, and he is crucified down in Jerusalem in the province called Judea, and there is a Roman governor who is in charge, namely Pontius Pilate. Okay. Now, this arrangement is something that goes on consistently until there's a war that breaks out in AD 66. What happens is a rebellion imagines itself just like the Jews who rebelled against the Greeks a couple of centuries earlier. And they said, if we threw out the Greeks, we can throw out the Romans. The Greeks were disintegrating, like I told you. The Romans were not. They were virtually at the height of their power at this time. And so therefore, the defeat of the Jewish kingdom by Roman legions was something that took place swiftly. This here is relief is taken from the arch of the conqueror, the Roman conqueror who finished Jerusalem. His name is Titus, and you can find this in the city of Rome on the inside of the triumphal arch there. All right, so we see that politics and rebellion, and what do we do with occupation? We've got the Persian, and then we've got the Hellenistic, the Greek occupation. We have Roman occupation. The entire New Testament is living under the Roman Empire. And what I would like to do now is ask the question, okay, so what is it that the average Jew would be feeling or inheriting as he lived in this period of time? The first thing I want to make very clear to each of you is this: do not separate Judaism from Hellenism. Because if you were living as a Jew in Herod the Great's kingdom, you would have been drinking deeply of the cup of Hellenism every single day. Hellenistic life, the speaking in Greek, all of this had permeated Jewish life and thought. It had completely. So we can discover Hellenistic forms of thought throughout Judaism with ease. This is kind of interesting, and I thought I would just illustrate it with this, but it comes from a couple centuries later, but this is the floor of a synagogue in Galilee. Now remember, it is a Jewish synagogue, but if you look carefully, what you'll see on the floor of this synagogue is the zodiac. The zodiac, what is that? It is a pagan sort of religious wheel, you might say, using astrology to determine your fate. But they decided it was kind of artistically beautiful, and they put it inside of their synagogue. Now, how could anybody do that? How could a Jew put a zodiac on the floor of their synagogue? It's because they have so assimilated into Roman culture that they don't see a problem with that. Now, there are some things which everybody would recognize if they lived in this period. If you lived in this period, you would recognize this as well. And that, first of all, it is all about imperial emperors. The Republican period of the Roman Empire ended with Julius Caesar, and from Julius Caesar's death, there was this understanding that when he died, he actually went to live in the heavens. Let me take a side route here for a minute. When the average Roman looked up at the night sky and they saw all of the stars, they did not see planets. What they saw were gods. And so therefore, there was this understanding that when Julius Caesar died, his own star moved into the heavens and it was visible above us. Now, he didn't have an heir, and so therefore he adopted a son named Octavius. And Octavius was given finally the name of Augustus as a nickname, which means mighty and great. So therefore, the heir to Julius Caesar's world was his son, adoptive son, Augustus, which you can see right here. This is, of course, a glorified picture of him. He is going to bring the great light to the Roman world. He is going to centralize power around the emperor. This is why we call these imperial emperors. In this period, they also understand that there is a divine endorsement on the work of the emperor. Now, right away, if you're thinking about the Christmas story of Jesus, and you should be, when you have a star over Bethlehem and you have the language of the Son of God in that story, you should be alert. Now, let me show you this beautiful gold coin that comes from Augustus. Here is Augustus. You can see his name on the left fairly easily. This is a fabulous coin. And then you can see here Divi Filius. This is an abbreviation of son. This means divine son. So the language of Son of God, divine son, is being used commonly for the greatest emperor the Romans had ever seen, Augustus. And I'll show you in a minute how it continues to be seen that way. This means that when you have the language of the Son of God being used for Jesus, you can imagine that people would perk up and notice. In fact, let me take you back to another idea. When you have the language of the Son of God who is building a kingdom, he talks about the kingdom of God regularly, you can imagine some people would say, this is politics. This is not theology. Well, if there are imperial emperors, there's also an imperial religion. At this time, in our culture, we really want to separate religion and politics. We often do. Muslims will tend to combine them much more comfortably than Christians. Christians keep them separated. They have today, but if you go back in time, that synthesis, that wedding of politics and religion is pretty much a constant throughout much of European history and all the way back to the ancient world. So when the Romans built temples, they saw worship in the temple as a political act. A statue of the emperor might well be inside of this temple. So therefore, when you go to give offerings, when you go to sacrifice, when you go for festivals, what you're doing is recognizing that Rome and its religion is marking the entire empire. So when you, in a province, go to that temple, you're acknowledging the power and presence of the Roman world. Now, the Romans, this is why Jews and Christians, they refused to go to the temples. This was a problem. Jews said, no, I'm not going to go to that temple. It's a pagan temple, but it also implies a recognition of Roman dominance. It does. And the Romans were always aware of that. And a Christian always had to ask himself or herself, do I go to these things? The Romans had a pantheon, many, many gods. And in fact, when they thought about somebody who would only believe in one god or didn't believe in the pantheon, the numerous lists of gods, they thought of that person, believe it or not, as an atheist. Now, there's something important about the Roman world that in this period of time, in the first century, that you can't miss. I call it the imperial gospel. Here is a coin, Caesar. This is coming from the Augustus period. Here is Divi Filius. Do you see it right there? You recognize the abbreviation now. But now what we have, look at here, we've got the Greek, you see the Greek hat on here? This is nice. There's some hair coming out the side, but you've got a nice stiff hat. You have a palm branch here, and this is a cornucopia. This is sort of bringing, filled with food is what it is. It's a horn which is filled with food, and this represents peace. Now, what is it that the Romans were offering to the world? In the 50 or 70 years before Augustus, the Roman world was considering marked instability. There were rivals that were trying to take control of the Roman Empire. Many of the provinces were in rebellion. And so therefore, the Romans were afraid that everything was going to fall apart. The Germans in the north, the Persians in the east, we are going to be attacked. And if we do not create a unified empire, we were going to suffer. And so therefore, Augustus offered what he called the Pax Romana. This is the peace of Rome. Now, what was the peace of Rome? If you read the New Testament, you know the language of the Pax Romana is everywhere. Everyone is talking about it. What is the formula? Augustus said, all right, look, we are going to have a unified empire that is going to be successful, and here are the three things that we are going to give to you. Number one, economic prosperity. Everybody loves the promise of economic prosperity. Number two, we are going to have family stability. So therefore, we're going to have, as the family goes, Augustus believed, so goes the empire. So therefore, we are going to have fathers, we're going to have a hierarchy of respect inside of the family, and fathers who are inside of families are given inordinate amount of power, family stability, and then security through might. Augustus is going to bring to the world the most advanced professional army the world has ever seen. So therefore, it is going to be violence. I'm going to suppress any province that is not going to be peaceful. But if we are all submissive, well, here's the key word. If we are all loyal, then we are going to have a successful empire. Now, here's the package then. Do you want to live in peace? Do you want to live in prosperity? Do you want to make sure your family and your estate does not fall apart all around you? Yes, you say you want that. That sounds good to me. This is the peace of Rome. This is the Pax Romana. So therefore, all Rome asks is for your loyalty. It asks for your heart. It asks for your devotion. So remember, when the Christians come along and they start talking about the gospel, they are talking about, well, peace, but it's going to be in competition with what we hear here in Rome. I like this coin. This is, here you see again, Divi Filius. Here we have the coin. Here is liberty, described right here. This is from Augustus, once again. But I want you to look here. Here you have this beautiful laurel wreath around, and then here's Pax. You see it right there in Latin? There's Pax. And here's an altar. So here you've got, not only do you have the scepter here, but you have got a Roman ruler standing. This is a priest who was there at the altar, the Roman altar, offering peace, and the peace, flip over the coin, and you'll see it's going to be from Augustus. Here is Augustus once again, a very famous, beautiful coin. Here he is sitting on a throne. And what is he offering to these supplicants? Here what you have is the trade of these olive branches, showing that there is now peace. This is a symbol, common symbol that you would have seen everywhere in the Roman Empire. It is the peace of Rome. Are you signing on to the peace of Rome? You'd probably say, yeah, I'm going to sign on to the peace of Rome. But those who are wise know that it will come at a price. I wanted to show this to you as well. This is another subsequent ruler after. His name is Caligula, who comes after Augustus. But I just wanted to show it to you for two reasons. First, notice that the star, do you see the star right there? That is the star of Julius Caesar, meaning the star, when Caligula dies, his star will also rise, meaning that he also has divine power. Look at the head covering that he has here. This, when we talk about the crown of thorns on Jesus, this is exactly what it is. This is a palm, and these all are, it's like radiant. It is like rays of sunshine coming out of his head. And this radiant, this is the symbol of what it means to have sort of a divine presence right over your life. This symbol of having this kind of crown with these thorns, the needles are taken off, but are all sticking up, is used throughout the empire. When they put the crown on Jesus, it is not as much a torture device, though you could make it that way. It is a mockery of this divine crown. Okay. All right, so we've already said, so imperial religion, I got that. Imperial gospel, I've got that. But now also what I call imperial power. Augustus has a professional army. As I said to you, he has now 28 Roman legions, which are astonishing. They have 6,000 people in each of them. I've got a little book, which is a fictional book called A Week in the Life of a Roman Centurion. And there you can see a description of what it would be like living in the Roman legion at that time, and what it would be like to work in Judea. They're professional troops. They are paid. They're not simply people who come and go after 1 or 2 years. The average membership was 10 years. Many of them went all the way to 20 years. You had to be single. You could not be married. But in some outlying areas, we know they got married. but they are distributed to the outlying provinces. Now that means that the Roman legions were present in the Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt had a Roman legion. There was one in Syria as well. They didn't put one in Judea because they were waiting to see if the family of Herod was going to be a good client state. So with the provinces like the Jews, you either convert to the Roman way of life or you get defeated. It's very simple. And they had no problem with conquering you and killing all of your leaders. Many people say that Rome had cultivated what we call a war culture. It was a culture that was intolerant of opposition and was, shall we say, it didn't persuade with diplomacy, it persuaded with the sword. This, by the way, is a beautiful, beautiful museum piece. It's called a cassis, and this is a Roman Imperial soldier's battle helmet. Now, there are certain things which the empire had, values, which were circulating widely in this world. And these are the values which would just come to you, just like my Korean friends drinking coffee. These are the values that you just don't think about, and you might even think they're Jewish values, but they're not. Well, let me give you some examples. Honor versus humility. The Romans were not, they did not like this notion of humility. In fact, there's no category for humility whatsoever. They thought humility was kind of putting yourself down. Instead, what you should do is collect honor in your life, and self-promotion was one of those ways. So anyway, there is a tension here. So when you read in the New Testament that we are to be known for our humility and our sacrifice and our service, that is a value that is contrary to the pursuit of honor in the Roman world. The pater familias, this is the father, the head of the family. This was something that Augustus wanted to promote in his family and the entire empire, but it meant the father had absolute say over everything. But when you read inside of the New Testament about, like in, I don't know, Ephesians 5, about how the Christian family should be built, and that a father should think of himself like Christ, who sacrifices himself to death, this is unheard of in the Roman world. And then thirdly, there are social hierarchies everywhere. This was a world that understood senators are at the top and the slaves are at the bottom. And so therefore, the pursuit of ascent in social hierarchy, going higher and higher, this is what you want out of your life. This is where honor is to be found. Now, notice when Paul writes his letters and when the early Christians correspond to each other, what they call themselves? They call themselves slaves. In English, it's often servants, but it's not. It is slave, doulos. It is a slave of Jesus Christ. Christians call themselves slaves, and they put themselves intentionally at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Lastly, there are what I call imperial instincts. Now, those other things that I were describing over here are values you pursue and you promote in your world. Here, what I'm talking about are things you don't even think about. Here's an example, Hellenistic dualism. Throughout the Hellenistic period, there was this notion that we live in a material world which is broken and corrupt and fallen and incomplete, but the gods live in another world which is not material. It is a world full of ideals. It is a world where truth lives. It is a world where the gods reside. And so therefore we call this dualism because it is separated. There is the above and there's the below. There is a dualistic language would be dark and light. So anyway, when the early Christians begin talking about Jesus, and they're saying basically in Colossians, Paul says, the one who embodies the absolute image of the invisible God. In other words, he's saying to the Hellenists, the one who lives in heaven has come down into the earth and actually taken on material form. To the average Roman, the Hellenist, that is scandalous. That makes no sense. The gods don't do that kind of thing. The second idea is the notion that there's only one God and there isn't a whole load of gods that you can be interested in. That is not only boring, but it's ridiculous. Why would you only have one God? Thirdly, there is this idea in the Roman world of what I call cultural superiority. In many ways, the Romans walked into the world thinking, well, we have a culture that is going to change you, that is going to evangelize you, because we have built the better society. And so therefore, when they came to another culture, they expected that culture to evolve into a Roman way of life. They didn't leave cultures alone. So therefore, here inside of the New Testament, we have this idea that somehow cultures are to be respected and not conquered. In other words, Christ can be at work in Roman culture and German culture and Persian culture and Jewish culture equally. Now, all of this simply says one thing. When the New Testament is presenting the gospel in its world, it is confronting and reacting to these values, this religious system, this political world. It understands Hellenism. And therefore, it is presenting a gospel that is contrary to the gospel being presented every single day. Now, if we read more about this, if we study it more, I think what happens is we begin to appreciate how remarkable the New Testament really is. Okay, so we've come to the top of the hour, and I know for you it is getting late, but let's take a little bit of time for some questions. So Carlos, let's go ahead and explore some questions that people have about the imperial influence on the Jewish world.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for your stimulating lecture. And I would like to ask Pak Yosafat, how much time do you give to us?
Yeah, we will have until 9:15, Carlo.
15 p.m. Okay. So before asking you a question, I would like to ask Johnny to to show the slide one more time. I would like to show the e-certificate sample that we will, we will provide to those who will submit the essay. Johnny, please. Thank you. Okay. While Johnny is preparing, you mentioned about the pater familias. There's a question about. Okay, Johnny is ready. Sorry. Yeah, it's coming. Okay, so this is the sample, brothers and sisters, Bapak Ibu. It will be a certificate of completion of this lecture, which consists of 2 days, today and next week, about Greco-Roman world of New Testament era. All right, so for like this example is Mr. Joko Wibowo has completed Sola Scriptura academic lectures, the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament era, with Professor Gary M. Burge, Ph.D. Okay, on October 15th and 22nd, 2021. It will be signed by our chairman, Dr. Zacchaeus Indrawan, it's my senior, and also by Professor Gary Burge. Okay, Gary, Professor, sorry. Bart Ehrman said that in the Roman world, they recognize pater familias, like you said, in choosing the religion. When we converted the husband, we got the wife, the slaves, the children in one package. The conversion of one person meant conversion of all members of the family. Can we conclude that Acts 16, 31, 32 have the same background as well?
Well, my first instinct, which should be all of our instincts, is to turn immediately to Acts 16.
Oh, yeah.
And I may have to make sure I know exactly.
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
okay. All right, got it. Yeah. So here what we have is an episode in Thessaloniki. And okay, let me just, it's about preaching. If you believe in the Lord Jesus, you'll be saved, you and your household. Okay.
Yeah.
Here is what we're up against. We are up against individualism. And individualism is a Western value which has gone out into the world like Starbucks coffee. So therefore, when we look at the world of the Roman world and the Jewish world, we have this idea that, well, okay, so if one person decides to have faith, that somehow means everybody has to follow. Well, so this is the way the Romans thought about life. It would be that a household had a faith, and therefore, if the leader of the household does embrace that faith, the expectation is those who are living along with this household leader, the pater familiar, he is going to actually then bring the entire household into faith at the very same time. It isn't as if the faith of the one gives salvation to the entire group. It is the faith of the one becomes a catalyst that brings about the faith of the whole. And so, yeah, so that is no doubt how people understood themselves. The idea that somehow you could make a private decision to follow Jesus Christ and break with your family is a pretty large idea. The New Testament is trying to move in that direction, but it's a very difficult thing. You would have to think, to get your head around this, you're going to have to think about a Muslim child growing up in a Muslim family in Pakistan, and then inside of that family deciding they wanted to become a Christian. Now, you can imagine the pressure would be enormous on that person. Try another one. Imagine a conservative or Hasidic Jewish child growing up in a Jewish family in which they have been Jews for 2,000 years. And the child says, I want to go and marry a Gentile. You're going to blow up the family. So there is a world in which social conformity is expected. It's the norm. This is how you live inside of this world. So here, what this text is saying is that, listen, if you believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, then what happens is there'll be a convert. The whole family has the possibility of coming along. But the New Testament is clear, however, as you come along, not only should you do that because of obedience, you should come along because you want to be a disciple of Jesus. So the early Christians are actually running a tightrope here. On the one hand, they're living in a corporate world in which conformity is important, but they're also saying to individuals inside of that corporate world, you have got to be able to make decisions as well. So anyway, it is a tension that you have inside of the New Testament, clearly a tension. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul is actually addressing the problem of people being married and one becomes a Christian and the other refuses to become a Christian. What do you do with that? In other words, a religious commitment, a new religious commitment breaks the family. So the early Christians are navigating a very difficult problem about individual choice and corporate obedience.
Thank you. Okay, now next question. I think this is very good. If the influence of the Hellenistic, so great around the world that is showed, right, including influencing the religion, the Jewish tradition and religion, can we find the footprints of the Hellenistic influence in the Jesus teaching and passed away and passed by the his disciples?
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's a really great question. Let me sort of begin sort of in a way you wouldn't expect. The penetration of Hellenistic thinking into Jesus' Jewish world is this extreme. The most conservative Jews I could imagine in Jesus' world were not living in Jerusalem. They were living down at the Dead Sea at a place called Qumran. You've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These people were so conservative, they did not want to live in Jerusalem, and they thought the priesthood was corrupt. And so they lived in the desert to live a purified life. They immersed themselves in water, we believe, on a daily basis to purify themselves. Okay. When we read their writings, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they are filled, even though they're writing in Hebrew, they are writing in Hebrew, but their heads are full of Hellenistic ideas. So they use, for instance, Hellenistic dualism. So therefore, this idea of light versus darkness, above versus below, that language is used at Qumran, which tells me that, oh my goodness, Jews who are very conservative, who would hate Hellenism, are actually drinking from Hellenism. It would be like somebody in Indonesia who really doesn't like the West, but they have a habit of going to Starbucks coffee. Now, that could be Carlos, I have no idea. But you could have somebody who would be like that, and they don't realize that Starbucks is Western. So therefore, when I look at Jesus' teaching and I hear him using, let me give you 2 examples. And he's talking to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, and he says, you must be born again to enter the kingdom of heaven. That language of rebirth, though it appears in Judaism, it's very, very rare, but it is huge in Hellenistic Judaism. So therefore, Jesus is actually using a concept that says that it really is a concept which would have been recognized immediately by Jews who are living inside the Hellenistic world. But if he used that same concept of rebirth, maybe 500 years earlier, Jews would have scratched their heads and said, what? Not really. What do you mean rebirth? In fact, Jesus says, you must be born anothen. And actually the Greek word there means from above. All right. So anothen means you have to be born from above, but we're living below. There's the Hellenistic dualism. So therefore, your life needs to be oriented here and not down here. This is a place of darkness. This is a place of light. So therefore, in Jesus' teaching, when he talks about light and darkness in chapter 9 of John's gospel, where he talks about above and below with Nicodemus and rebirth in chapter 3, he is actually using the language Jews are using who have been going into the Hellenistic world and adopting its language.
Thank you. If I may combine with the question in John 12, you can, if I can read it to you. Now there were some Greeks among those who were going up to worship at the feast. These then came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and began to ask him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus.
Right.
All right. And then, I mean, why did they want to see Jesus? I mean, somebody, got a commentary that they want to hijack Jesus to be there.
No. Yeah. Okay, there's 2 things going on here. First of all, let's just simply make sure we're clear about who these guys are. So in John 12, it's a great passage. Jesus' final trip to Jerusalem. He's at the very top of his ministry. He has popularity all around him. There are people plotting on his life, but he's quite popular. So anyway, these are people who are living in Bethsaida, which this is where land and geography comes into play. So friends, think about what I said about Western Galilee and Eastern Galilee. So Bethsaida is in Eastern Galilee. It is a highly Hellenized environment. His family, he's Jewish, his family named him Philip. Do you remember who Philip is? Philip was the father of Alexander the Great. So when you think about it, they were picking, I don't know, you'd have to pick a name today for your child.
Just like me. I'm Indonesian, but my name is Carlo. It's Italian.
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, what a terrible Indonesian name is that? So yeah, it's the same thing. So what you have are Jews coming to Jesus who are filled with Hellenistic culture. Now, there we have it. There it is. There's interest in Jesus. Now, you have to go back to the beginning of the Gospel of John and see that any disciple who is a real disciple has his own personal experience with Jesus and sees him and then stays with him and follows him. Those are the 3 markers of discipleship. You see him for yourself. You don't get it secondhand. You see him for yourself. You remain with him. You stay with him. The Greek word is meno. And then you follow him. That's the other key word. Now go back to the beginning of John and go all the way through. And every time you find a disciple, it's going to be that. The woman at the well actually has an encounter with Jesus. And she stays with him there. Doesn't walk away. Okay. So when these Hellenistic Jews come to Jesus in John chapter 12, they are exhibiting the signs of discipleship. They are interested in becoming disciples. They want to see him. They want to come and be where he is. And the question is, will they follow?
All right. Okay. A quick question, probably for a quick answer. Does it mean that Pax Romana was a rival to gospel, or did Pax Romana offer to Jewish too? All right. Or it was offered or only attracted to the Gentiles?
Oh no, it was Pax Romana. The offer of the imperial gospel goes to everyone, to every province. So the Jews actually looked at this, and you can imagine some would say, why not? Why not cooperate with the Romans? Because they'll give us a better life. And other Jews would say, wait a minute, do you know what you're getting here? You'll get the better life, but you must bend the knee to Rome. So you can see that there's a tension. Well, since I'm an American, I can say this. There are countries in the world that wonder, should we really cooperate with America? You might benefit economically, but what else comes with it? So the imperial gospel is actually a political offer. And with that comes a religious obligation. Yeah, every Jew was confirmed. Yeah, you walked around with a Pax Romana coin in your pocket.
Okay. All right. Luke 23. I'll read for you. Luke 23, 47. Now when the centurion saw what had happened, he began praising God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. All right. And then the question is, how could a centurion, could come to the conclusion that Jesus is the right man?
Right. I think we have to be careful that we don't put back on that centurion the theological language that we use for ourselves. Okay. So therefore, I don't think that centurion has a Trinitarian view of God. He is not looking at Jesus and saying, aha, this is the Son of God as the church understands the Son of God. What he is acknowledging is that what I have in front of me is a divine moment. In other words, Son of God is being used widely inside of the empire. So he is simply signifying that he thinks that what is happening here is connected to the heavens. It is connected. Remember, it goes dark. It goes dark when Jesus is on the cross. All of these things are disturbing to a man whose life is very, very superstitious. So I don't think, now I think for Mark or Luke, this is ironic. It's ironic because from the Roman centurion's point of view, he's just acknowledging what he thinks is the gods must be at work. But when Luke tells us this story, he wants you to see that when someone has a real encounter with the cross, they see things they can barely comprehend. This man is saying something he doesn't yet understand. But we as Christians, when we read this, we say, he is on the right path.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, next question. You said that that at that time, according to the Roman worldview that you mentioned, that the divine could not come to the this material world, right?
Right.
How about the other worldview that says that they also believe in the Greek gods and goddess, all right, to become a man, all right?
Right.
In the Acts that people, thought that Paul and Silas, is just like a gods,
Right. Right. So
world.
yeah, it's a great question. So that in the Greek stories, the Greek myths, you do have this notion that somehow the gods make an appearance in this world. And so as we think, well, how can you have that when you have a Hellenistic dualism? How do those two things go together? And here's the difference. What we have in those mythologies is the gods actually participating, sort of making a visit, we'll call it a visit, into this world, but not taking on the full attributes of this world. So in other words, what we have in Christ is God who, I'll say to you from Philippians 2, verse 5, have this mind in you, which was in Christ, though he was in the form of God, did not hold on to that status, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant and taking on human form. The incarnation with Christ's departure and release of some of those divine attributes and coming in and taking on human form, the form of a servant, has no parallel in the Roman world. So therefore, when Apollos or Mercury or, I don't know, Zeus, we have a story about him somehow operating inside of this world, he is not sympathetically embracing our humanity in order to serve us. So there's no incarnational notion inside, there's no incarnation, as it were, inside of the Greco-Roman worlds.
Yeah, but you showed the picture at the beginning that the Zeus is kind of a man.
Yeah, oh, I know, sure. That's the way I imagine him as he is in heaven. That's exactly how I imagine him.
That's the way they think.
Yeah, exactly. So therefore, it becomes a projection. So, there are different levels of, among the Greek writers about religion, the myths and the images like this, many would say that these are serving people who really are not very thoughtful about their faith. I mean, you have public consumption of religion. And so therefore the temple and the statue and the idols, I mean, these things serve a certain segment of the population. But there are those who are strict Hellenists, who are dualists, who would say, well, these are images which we need to imagine who God is, who Zeus really is. And so therefore people who are more thoughtful say, they don't even take these myths seriously. They actually see these myths as stories to help illiterate people imagine their world more successfully. And that kind of thing goes on today as well. It goes on today in the very same manner. There are people who organize their lives around stories that have no truth, and that others who are a bit more sophisticated in their thinking realize that is not who God is.
Okay, we come to the end. Thank you again, Professor Burge. But remember, we will be with you again next week, and for brothers and sisters. All right.
Next week, what we'll be talking about next week is the Jewish world. We'll be talking about, if you lived in Jerusalem or Galilee, what would be the forces that would be around your life? And yeah, it'll strictly about, we'll move from the Hellenistic to the Jewish.